most capitalist societies, even rich capitalist societies, and we just saw this with the election, like the majority of society is really struggling to make ends meet. That to me is, again, from a Marxist perspective, this kind of mass base who, if we could figure out ways to organize, is I think hungry for transformative change, which is of course what we need for climate change too.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start, there's a lot I want to talk about today, and so hopefully we can fit it all in. But I think it's probably best to start with your book itself. You wrote a book a few years back called Climate Change as Class War. Straightforward title, doesn't pull any punches. And I think has a lot of relevance to where we are today, what has happened. As we record, we've just seen the results of the US election. So I think probably as a jumping off point, it would be helpful to start with how actually you sort of understand class, and particularly how you define the working class, which you see as sort of integral to addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah, so, the book came out at a time when a lot of people were talking about climate change as a problem of inequality or carbon inequality, and they tend to have a certain idea of class that was really just focused on people's income and their consumption practices and their kind of lifestyle practices. So I was just at a talk today where someone's describing, the rich, they have over-consumptive lives, and they eat meat, they ride private jets, and really focusing on like basically the wealthy and how they spend their money. And it really struck me as a longtime Marxist that none of this discussion of class really was rooted in a Marxist definition, which is not really focused on consumption at all, and is focused on your relationship to production and the relationship to the means of production. And really, I think from a Marxist view, kind of the materialist view of history, like production is sort of the anchor of how we should really understand any society, of how societies materially produce their basic means of subsistence, and the power relations that surround access and control to that production is kind of the secret in a Marxist view of how you really understand that society and really understand the specific kind of whatever cultural and political aspects of that society. So fast forwarding, then again, like no one was talking about climate change really as rooted really in production, right? It's really how we organize our production system and who owns it and controls it. And of course, rich people are obnoxious with the way they spend their money in consumption, right? But I think if we oriented our attention more on how they generate their money, how they make their money, and as owners and investors and as people making profits on those investments, I think we'd find that those activities have way more carbon impacts. So you can have a CEO of a chemical company that probably spends most of his time 8 to 12 hours a day sort of organizing a global network of chemical factories that are belching out huge amounts of emissions day after day. And that person could be a vegetarian and take public transit and have a low carbon footprint, and no one would argue that person isn't really responsible and culpable in a class sense for climate change. So it really struck me that we really need to kind of change the analysis of class and really get back to that Marxist basics of looking at production and who owns it, who profits from it. And obviously a lot of this came out of, I think, a lot of the left was talking already about how insufficient it was to just focus on people's individual carbon footprint as being the sort of narrative of how we change or how we transform society. And you also, I think, asked about the working class. So in a capitalist society, of course, the standard story is that it's really just a minority of society that how they sort of own capital and they invest that capital seeking returns on that capital for their income. And also they really control and have the power, decision-making power over all of society's resources and production. And so that's a very tiny minority of society. And the standard Marxist narrative is that for most of society, and I always ask my students, what % of you, raise your hand, when you graduate, are planning to just get a job for a wage to get employed by someone else to make money to reproduce your life. And the majority of the class always raises their hand because that's the reality for most people in a capitalist society. They have to sell their labor power in the market for a wage to survive. And it's important to point out that, again, when the climate discussion is so much about our consumption, that our consumption is really not oriented towards profits and accumulation. It's oriented toward using money to just reproduce our needs in our lives and everyday basics. And sometimes, again, people can be obnoxious and extravagant with those needs. But the logic of consumption is not like capital in production, where it's seeking returns and accumulating and investment. And so again, from that perspective, you really can just conclude that the working class is this majority of society that, in many ways, I try to argue in the book, it's really it's an ecological class that's been torn from the land and from any kind of secure source of livelihood, so that they kind of have to survive through the market, which is a very insecure and stressful way to live, ecologically speaking, in the world. And therefore, so obviously the working class is this vast majority of society. The problem is, of course, it's highly heterogeneous. It's very differentiated. I've come around even to, we can even include what I call the professional class as part of this kind of big, diverse working class. But the main point I want to try to get across in the book is that in most capitalist societies, even rich capitalist societies, and we just saw this with the election, like the majority of people, like I would say the sort of rough number I often use, like 60 to 65, 70% of society is really struggling to make ends meet, to really, they in my country, they worry about healthcare, they worry about housing, they worry about paying utility bills, the kind of the classic yellow vest, like the end of the month struggles to make ends meet are sort of front of mind. And so this sort of fundamental proletarian insecurity that working class people feel by, again, having to survive through the market is really kind of this this mass basis of kind of, again, insecurity that I think has this sort of material interest there for change, right? Because I think most working class people don't feel like life is good or stable. Most people feel it's quite stressful and exhausting to live under capitalism. So that to me is, again, from a Marxist perspective, this kind of mass base who, if we could figure out ways to organize, is I think hungry for transformative change, which is of course what we need for climate change too. So,
as a North American, albeit Canadian, but as a North American who moved to the UK, I was really struck by how present the idea of class is in kind of all forms of discussion in the UK, particularly political discussion. Politicians will regularly talk about the working class particularly. But in North America, it feels like that's very much less the case. I mean, Biden sort of spoke to it a little bit, but for a long time, everyone was focused on the middle class, this kind of nebulous middle class. And class in general is so much less spoken about, I think, in North America. So, I mean, do you have an insight into why that is, how that happened?
Really, in the last 50 years of what we call neoliberalism, there was this kind of, that I remember growing up, there would always be this, if anyone brought up resentment towards the rich or things like that, people called it class warfare, which I guess my book is. And people would say you shouldn't do class warfare. It's like almost like that people felt like we got beyond, we're like in this sort of where everyone's middle class and comfortable society. We don't need to do class warfare anymore. Yeah, it's like very rude and crude and. But in the book, I quote a famous quote from one of the richest people alive, Warren Buffett, who in 2006, he's like, well, yeah, there's class warfare going on, and it's my class, the rich class, that's waging it, and we're winning, right? And that kind of, I think, threw on a light to what was really going on in that economy, which was really a kind of massive class war from above, or organizing the economy to redistribute wealth upwards over the last several decades, and all the while, increasingly neoliberalism was just rooted in this highly individualistic and entrepreneurial ideology that people felt if they were poor or they were struggling, it was their own fault, right? That it wasn't a part of a class system that was sort of trapping them in poverty and exploiting them, but it was that of their own sort of moral failings. And so, yeah, like people weren't really talking about class much. And so that was, again, I think that was true in academia too. It was not really fashionable to talk about class, I would say like 10 years ago. So then again, sort of waking up to understanding climate change in this class terms, like seemed like a big lightning bolt for me to just try to go back to basics of this kind of class language. But I will say, and I know we'll talk about this, but with the election, with this massive shift of what people are now calling the working class to Trump, I think people are sort of waking up. Well, I thought they woke up in 2016, but they're waking up again to the centrality of class.
You said it, so I'm going to make you talk about it now. The election.
Yeah.
I want to, there's so much to dive into, and it's just happened, so I know that any analysis will be sort of fresh and partial, which is fine. But I feel like with Trump in particular, he's sort of been followed throughout his political career by this idea that he's sort of galvanizing this kind of mythical white working class voter, and that's how we explain his entire sort of ascendancy. But obviously, if you kind of look beneath the hood of what's actually happening, it's much more complicated than that. So in a way, my question to you is, with this second, much more successful election of Trump, what just happened is a little bit the question. Why were there so many losses for Democrats? Why was he so much more successful this time around? In what ways have the conditions changed? And he was, more successful this time around with the lowest income brackets of American voters, much more so than in 2016, despite the fact that, Biden, many would argue, sort of really tried to pivot in some ways toward appealing to the American working class. So, to boil it down, what just happened?
Well, I have to admit, it was, I guess, 2 days ago, and it's fresh, and I'm still feeling a lot of anger.
Yeah.
In many ways, this book came out of the anger and sort of rage I felt about really kind of a sort of, not just liberals, but even the sort of radical activist milieu sort of was sort of stuck in their own little bubble and not paying attention to the real, again, the wreckage of life in neoliberal Obama era capitalism, where it's sort of like the financial crisis hit and most people were wiped out and a lot of people didn't seem to care. And then, of course, we come to 2024, and poll after poll after poll is showing that the number one issue for voters is the economy and inflation and the cost of living. And the Harris campaign was like a retread of Clinton era Obama messaging on the economy. Their slogan was an opportunity economy. That's what they were trying to present. A bunch of stuff about like tax credits for homeowners and entrepreneurs. Like, it was like, I was like, are we back in the 1990s? Yeah. What is happening? And so it was clear they just had no real answer for the pain that most of the working class was feeling with the cost of living crisis and inflation. And I think a lot of what Biden did was good. And, he really tried to center unions and the investments that were going into the Inflation Reduction Act. But there was, and again, partially not entirely his fault. It's because of our broken political system, because we can't get anything passed. But, it just, they didn't have any answer for the people suffering over inflation. These sort of selective investments of jobs going to this factory here and this factory there, by the way, brought to you by private corporations that get tax credits. So no one's like clearly linking these investments to a political project linked to the Democratic Party or linked to Biden. I live in Syracuse, New York, where there's a huge investment coming from the chip manufacturer called Micron. And everyone in the local community talks about Micron this, Micron that. No one's talking about Bidenomics this, or this is a political investment in our community. And so, the stuff he did, some of it was good, but there was no broad-based attempt to really solve the number one thing people were worried about, which was the cost of living. And so I think most people, because of being hammered by inflation, people are just angry, they're fed up. And if you looked at those two candidates and you're wondering who is the candidate that's sort of against the establishment, against the status quo, there's really only one choice, because I think Harris's campaign was much about sort of joy and protect
brat,
the brat summer, and sort of protecting like the norms of democracy, and sort of like really, in many ways they're like saying we want to sort of preserve the status quo. So it just wasn't the time for that kind of message, and they could have gone much more left with the economic plans. They didn't, and we saw the result: definitive crushing. So
Yeah, very definitive. I mean, I've already seen in some of the kind of various group chats that I'm in of climate people, much to my chagrin, a lot of fear that this will be read as an indictment of doing any kind of climate policy. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, as Biden's flagship policy, really, it's not explicitly a climate bill, but obviously so much of it was oriented around investment in sort of the industries of climate. And I've seen people worried that this is a, rejection of that, a rejection of the centrality of climate politics, climate being this kind of elite issue that was kind of rejected en masse. I mean, I think there's various reasons why that's wrong, not least, most people, as you've pointed out when we were speaking earlier, most people had never heard of the Inflation Reduction Act by the time the election rolled around. But beside that, what do you make of this point that this loss will be read as an indictment of acting on climate and kind of that it should be read as that?
Well, in many ways, I would say the Harris campaign already picked up that message somehow, because they were determined to never mention climate change and to even more to constantly boast
about fracking.
Fracking, and the fact that they have overseen a massive expansion of oil and gas production under their watch. In fact, because of the cost of living crisis, Biden did not try to do any sort of systematic structural economic reform, but instead he begged the oil and gas industry to produce more to lower gas prices, right? Because that's what he's worried about politically. And he begged Saudi Arabia to do the same, So they had a bunch of Democratic strategists on hand who told them climate's not really an issue that people care about, which, I think there's some evidence behind that. I think it's probably because they're not able to make it an issue that connects with people. But in any case, so they chose to not make it. It was really striking because 2020, the Green New Deal and climate was a big topic, right? And it was a huge part of that election. And this time, almost no discussion of it and no centering of that crisis as part of the campaign. And so, it'd be kind of annoying if they're like, we've now learned to not campaign on climate when they didn't campaign on climate. But to me, it goes back, again, I feel like this conversation is me sort of talking about these sad stories of, if we could have done it in the way we wanted to in 2020, and things would have turned out differently. But our vision of a Green New Deal in those heady days of 2018 to 2020, when that was like a vision, and we had AOC and the Sunrise Movement, really, that vision was much more about really broad-based universal public goods and public investments that could touch people on an everyday basis. And the most obvious one is like a public job guarantee, where that if that were to be implemented, that would be hiring people and communities all across the country to do socially useful work to help on this climate crisis, but also help on the crisis of inequality and neoliberalism. And the other thing I like to point out is that really the sectors of the economy that we need to transform for climate change are very core working class needs. It's energy, it's housing, it's transportation, it's food. These are, if we could figure out a way to really take public control and intervene in those sectors in a way that the aim is decarbonizing them, but also giving more secure access to the working class of those key material needs. That's the way to kind of connect climate to people's, again, those end of month, like economic kitchen table issues. But you need a political movement and a political program that's really about making those links. And I think I already said this, but for all the good stuff about Biden's climate investments, they were very narrow. They were not broad-based public investments and public goods, and again, a lot of them came under the name of private corporations getting tax credits, not public, like the old New Deal, where it's like FDR's face is on things, and it's clear the government is coming in to sort of help and build social shared infrastructure for poor people and investing in crucial communities, right? So it's really tough because we don't have a lot of time on this crisis.
Yeah.
And so it feels like we miss an opportunity to really make climate a more popular, a more resonant material issue. And as long as it's seen as this sort of, again, this very abstract scientific issue about planetary biogeochemical cycles, I think it's not going to really resonate with most everyday people. And we have to find a way to kind of make those links to people's lives.
Yeah. I mean, on that point, I kind of want to talk about something that you've been quite a vocal critic of, which is another sort of increasingly popular, I would say, sort of thread of the ecological and climate movements, which is the idea of degrowth.
Of course.
Yeah, had to get there. And, you know, I'm going to sort of do a very crude oversimplification of what degrowth is, which is sort of, you know, the idea that in general, because we can't sort of decouple is the word, GDP growth from things like carbon emissions or, you know, deforestation, resource use, all these things in absolute terms, that the solution is that we need to think about in aggregate sort of bringing an end to economic growth, either as a policy goal or, you know, through generally kind of reducing a lot of what we consume and produce. And, you know, I think intuitively it's really appealed to, you know, a lot of people, at least within people who are very engaged on climate, which, as you write in your book, tends to be this kind of professional managerial class, kind of ourselves, right? Academics, people who work in think tanks, people who work in the climate movement and sort of green tech, all these things. But I'd love to know, you know, what specifically it is that you think degrowth gets so wrong and why you think it's a dead end for the climate movement.
The main point I do want to get across in the book is that it does appeal very strongly, and I live amongst these people and I get the appeal. It appeals very strongly to a highly educated, climate aware, and to be frank, like radicalized by the ecological crisis and feeling like we need transformative change, which we do. But you know, if you even look who the you know, it is getting increasingly popular, but I think even narrower, it's not just the professional class. Like if you look at who really are the people promoting degrowth, it's mostly academics, like mostly people with PhDs. And, you know, in the United States, like 2% of the country has PhDs. It's really not a broad base of society. You know, again, the main problem, I think it is a just sort of rhetorical message. It just sounds like less. And as you said, like when you kind of sort of narrow into the question, most people will say, yeah, we really do want to sort of at aggregate reduce, right? A planned reduction of throughput or something, right? And to me, again, like, in a context where the majority of society are struggling through these decades of austerity like that, if you're centering reduction less, degrowth, it's just like, it just doesn't seem like that's a really inspiring message for people to hear, right? And then it's even worse because I think you start talking to degrowthers, and when I talk to them, I actually find that we agree on a lot of stuff, right? And the main thing we agree is actually, as much as they want to hold on to this idea of aggregate degrowth, what they really want is actually to grow a lot of good stuff that we need, like clean energy and public transit and public housing and kind of these what they call universal basic services. Like we need to grow a lot of that stuff, and we just want to couple that with the degrowth of the bad stuff, right? And you know, fossil fuels, number one, but also destructive military types of production and all sorts of unnecessary, wasteful production. And so I'm on board with that. Grow the good stuff, degrow the bad stuff. But what we call that is socialist planning. That's what I would just call it. And what we want to do is democratize the economy and actually sort of have a democratic deliberation over what do we need actually as a society, how much, what is a reasonable housing system for people to feel, you know, like they're living a good life, and how much energy do we need, and these have to, you know, we want to kind of and we want to make those deliberative democratic planning decisions in relation to the ecological constraints that we face as a society, and that's why we so desperately need planning, right? Because under capitalism we kind of again, even Joe Biden's acting like, oh God, gas prices are high. I must now start begging for more oil production, because it's like we live in a capitalist economy where we act like we can't control the economy. It's just this sort of market system that goes up and down, and we don't know how to control it. So if we could build the kind of power that could take collective control over the economy, then we start to figure out, again, what is a good life, what are our collective needs, and how can we plan society in relation to those ecological constraints. So I think we want a movement that inspires the working class to build the kind of power to be able to make those collective deliberations over what we need. And I think degrowth's not very useful for that kind of political project. We need to be crystal clear to the masses of people, like, what do you stand to win and gain from our program and from our movements? And I think degrowth, you notice when you talk to degrowth people, they're often like, no, that's not what degrowth means. Yeah. It means the good stuff, right? And so we're already on the back foot when we're doing it. And so ultimately, and I know, as you may have heard, I've taken a lot of flack for this, but ultimately I think that degrowth is harming our ability to build power and build mass movements. And so that's why I've tried to, I think there's a good tradition in socialist and Marxist movements of polemics and trying to kind of lay down sort of like, okay, if we want to build this politics, we got to sort of lay lines down in the sand. And I think degrowth is not helpful for building a sort of mass politics that we need. So
I want to talk about how we do build that mass politics. Have you answer all the hard strategic questions. I think, based on the way that you outlined who the working class is, your argument is that because what we need is a broad-based movement, you need the majority of people to be organized around an idea. That obviously makes a lot of sense. But then when you kind of get down to the nuts and bolts of who actually sort of falls within the working class and how you would sort of unify people in a kind of organized way, particularly when you have, the kind of precariousness of academia and various other professional jobs, you've got this kind of nebulous working class. Mm-hmm. Where do you start in terms of organizing what is an incredibly heterogeneous, as you said, group of people? Well,
it's not easy. But traditionally, I think the vehicle for that is a political party that can, sort of pull together diverse working class people and try to come together to a common set of principles, and particularly a common sort of political program. And again, having sort of a common set of demands, which again, degrowthers would agree, we want to lower the work week, right? We want to have fewer working hours, but also, and we, when we started to build these movements around Medicare for all and that Green New Deal and these kinds of slogans, I mean, it's very clear to mass majorities of society that could benefit from, particularly something like Medicare for all in a country that commodifies healthcare. And so, we've been banging our head against the wall in the United States for centuries over how to actually build that kind of political organization. We have kind of capitalists have a grip on our political system and our party system, so we're still sort of not sure how to do this, but that is traditionally the vehicle. And to me, the key term is organization. We need mass organizations, and those can be unions, but I think you also need political organizations, and typically those have been parties. But again, there are these kind of weird institutional barriers to building a mass left party in the United States. It's hard, and people are isolated and atomized and again, tired. Yeah. And so getting, when you ask people to join collective organizations, they see a lot of reasons not to. And so that's another reason why you got to sort of make it really attractive in terms of what you're going to win if you join this, and also make it clear that immediately that you can sort of translate fights, struggles, into wins that actually see material results in people's lives and start to build confidence that it's a slogan, but when we fight we win, and sort of creating that feeling that collective struggle can bring the goods, or whatever people say these days. But that's hard work, and I think you have to overcome the real cynicism, or Vivek Chibber calls resignation, that the working class tends to feel, that things are really terrible, but there's really not much we can do about it, right?
It's been interesting to watch from the outside, at least, what seems like a resurgence in some ways in very kind of active union organizing across the United States. So I'd love if you could just walk us through some of that kind of surge in union activity in the US. Particularly, I'm thinking of, the United Auto Workers, which I'd love for you to sort of unpack for everyone. And to sort of speak to, what that kind of organizing could mean when it comes to climate change.
When you look around in terms of what mass membership organizations exist, and particularly in the United States, it's unions, right? Like that's the one thing that exist. And so the problem is our union movement has been marginalized, it's been crushed, and even though we still have roughly 10% of people in unions, and that's a lot of people, it's like 14 million people, a huge proportion of that people don't feel like their union is like, fighting for them, or people are apathetic and they're like, oh, they're taking my dues money. And so it's a heavy lift. But it starts by kind of rebuilding the member sort of activism in the unions themselves, and that's what the United Auto Workers did. It really started with something called a reform caucus, where what they wanted to do was, they called it the one member, one vote campaign. They just wanted, it sounds crazy, but the UAW had this really corrupt leadership that didn't allow members to vote on the leadership in a democratic way. So
wild.
Yeah, so they're just like, we would just like one member, one vote. And so they were trying to just really reform the rules of the union about how leadership is elected and democratize it, right? And so when they did that, they were able to win those changes. And then, of course, when they had an election to elect new leadership, they were able to squeak by one of their own militant activist union people, which was Sean Fain. And then this is kind of exactly what I'm talking about, is that when you get someone who's really out of this kind of class struggle approach to trade unionism, he immediately, I think a few months into his leadership, realized they're on a contract negotiation with the big three automakers, and that, we got to fight. We got to go on strike and really use workers' power that we have, which is to withdraw our labor and cause a crisis. So he did that, and he did it in a really strategic, not just him, like the whole union did it in a really strategic way to kind of, he called it the stand-up strike, harken back to the sit-down strikes of the auto workers in Flint, Michigan in the 1930s. But to really strategically look at the supply chains of these automakers and hit them at very key plants, right? To shut down their most profitable plant for whatever SUV is profitable these days.
All of them.
And so they were able to really wage huge costs to these corporations. At one point, General Motors had lost $800 million because of these strikes, right? So that's real power and real leverage that they built up. And so lo and behold, they win a record contract, the best contract that the UAW has won in decades. And again, this is kind of the idea, when we fight, we win. When they won that, I think a lot of workers in the auto sector looked around and said, wow, I'd like to get that. And so they're able to go down to Chattanooga, Tennessee in the US South and win a union election in a Southern auto plant, which has really never happened. And so, of course, I should be clear, they have lost some elections. It's still an uphill battle, and US labor law is freaking just a mess. Makes it really hard to win union elections. But I think that is kind of like, this is the theory of change that a lot of sort of radical union activists like to point to, is that, you start from the ground up, a reform caucus of committed activists in the union. You try to transform the union from the rank and file upwards. And then when you build a more democratic union, members start to feel more ownership in the organization, more empowered by the organization. And again, when you start to win things, they see that they're actually getting good stuff from being involved in the union and the organization. So that is the kind of theory. And I think, if we can start to see these kinds of rank and file reform caucuses and other things taking off in other unions, that's sort of the way to go. I still, again, think we really are going to need a vehicle beyond just the unions. We're going to need some sort of political vehicle, party, whatever you want to call it, and we're still not clear on that. But I think the more you get these unions fighting, the more you get a kind of resurgent labor movement in general, you're going to start to coalesce political forces that can start to bring that together. But I think it really starts with a revived labor movement. I think a lot of what my book's trying to argue is that workers and the labor movement have this kind of It's not that they're the most oppressed part of society. It's that they have this strategic structural power by doing the work that society depends on. Sure. And they can leverage that power to create, as the late wonderful Jane McAlevey would always say, like, to create a crisis in society, to really force elites to respond to win transformative types of demands. And the real problem we face is that labor movement has, again, been crushed. And workers, really, if you look at like strike activity, it kind of fell off a cliff in the 1980s. And so workers have kind of forgotten the power that they have. And so they have to relearn it. And that's what the UAW is starting to teach people, and we can see if it can spread. And we've had a lot of inspiring examples in teacher strikes and things like that. So that, to me, is the most inspiring, hopeful thing I see, but it's still like there's a long way to go. And
I'd love to know, specifically how that applies to organizing around climate.
Yeah,
because, no, it's okay. It's a natural follow-up. And in part because I think, the nature of where unionization remains, is within lots of industries that stand to, on the surface, lose out from this transition, whether that's, energy obviously is sort of nuanced because it's more of a sort of change ideally to a different form, but, fossil fuel workers, forestry workers, all sorts of kind of heavy production. And, in the past, those unions have been, when it comes to climate, often, quite conservative. It's the same in the UK. In response to the Clean Power Plan, I can't remember which union it was now, but there was a sort of strong union response. They occupied like a government building.
It was IBEW. Yeah.
Right, in response to Obama's Clean Power Plan.
Yeah.
And so I guess, where do you start there, and how do you organize within the labor movement on climate in particular?
So, obviously, the buzz term we use around this idea is a just transition. We have to sort of convince workers that there will be justice as we transition to this new economy, and that term came out of the trade union movement in the 1990s. Really, a trade union environmentalist named Tony Mazzocchi, who's part of the oil and chemical atomic workers. He built a movement in his union to basically agitate for what became the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, which was really about chemical companies that were putting profits ahead of the health and bodies of their workers, and really fighting for more safety standards in the workplace as a kind of environmental issue, because if you can keep your workers safe in the factory, you keep the community safe in the air and water outside the factory. So that kind of really inspiring movement around occupational health and toxicity and this kind of stuff. In the 90s, he was an environmentalist, and he sort of was looking at, there's a lot of these toxic, dirty industries that we need to shut down. And his idea of a just transition really was inspired by his own experience as a veteran of World War II. Mm-hmm. He benefited from something called the GI Bill, where you get, free education and housing and income support to basically transition from the war economy to the civilian economy. Mm-hmm. And this is what he kind of imagined we need to really convince workers that they're going to be taken care of if we shut down these industries. You need kind of a mass rollout of kind of the welfare state to kind of really give people something like 5 years of full 100% income supports, free education, and other sort of real material supports to transition. So, unfortunately, like in the intervening decades, it's just become this kind of co-opted buzzword, and it's sort of devolved into meaning like you're going to go show up at a training center and get new skills and, learn to code or something, like it's not become his vision, which I think. And so most workers in these industries either have never heard of a just transition or tell you to stop using that word, because all they see is sort of devastation in their communities. Coal miners and coal power plant workers, they're just seeing stuff shut down. They're seeing unemployment. They're not seeing any just transition. So, so the idea, though, is that, the unions, I think, are basically we're gonna need to build political power. And again, I don't think it's going to be like a climate movement that sort of wins on climate in a narrow kind of single issue way. My sort of, I wish I could have been clearer about this in the book, is that really what we need to imagine is kind of a more broad-based anti-austerity movement that is going to be ignited by, again, a resurgent labor movement that's really calling for, again, mass investment in public goods and public infrastructure, and not just climate investments like, childcare,
Sure.
healthcare, and like the, basic infrastructure of people's lives. And that kind of mass anti-austerity movement could lead to the type of mass climate investments we need in transit and housing and electricity systems and all the infrastructure we need to make this transition. And again, if you could again couple that mass investment program, public goods, I don't know, call it a Green New Deal, whatever, you could then also, again, we're doing this massive public program, so you would have that kind of GI Bill inspired just transition program for the displaced workers. And I think the idea is if those workers really did feel like they would be taken care of, maybe they would be more open to the transition. Because kind of going back to my basic idea of like the fundamental insecurity of proletarian life, people, especially where there's not much of a social safety net, people will choose their jobs over the environment because they're scared and they know that to live in capitalism you need those jobs, right?
Yeah.
And so as long as we're sort of vague about like, well, you can train and then you'll get a job as a solar something, we don't know, but it'll be fine.
Trust us.
Yeah, they're going to be hostile to that. But I think and also I think we need to think creatively about skills that do translate into the green economy directly. I don't know if you have had her, but Holly Jean Buck's book called Ending Fossil Fuels had a really cool idea. She called it reverse engineering. You could hire oil and gas workers in a public carbon removal program to actually use their skills that they use to extract the carbon out of the ground to actually put it back in through carbon removal type of programs. There's a new kind of geothermal renewable energy called advanced geothermal. The dirty secret is that it's basically fracking. It's a kind of drilling that relies on the technology of fracking. Okay. And so of course we're already seeing oil and gas workers transition into advanced geothermal. But geothermal is clean and renewable, and it's also can be 24/7 power. Sure. So that kind of what people call firm power that can complement
base load.
Yeah. So that's the kind of really exciting things, and I think you can see other examples: offshore wind, offshore oil and gas. These are similar. I think we have to value the industrial skills and knowledge that these workers have, and sort of make the case that we need your skills, and we need these skills in the new economy, right? Rather than say, your job is. I remember Hillary Clinton said, hey, "We're going to put you in the unemployment lines or something."
Oh my God. Anyways, I'm going to have to leave that to the side.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I want to zoom out a little bit. I want to understand. I mean, it's through no fault of your own, you are American, you work on the U.S. This is very much focused on what we do in the U.S. Yeah. And it could probably be replicated in somewhere like the U.K. or Canada and various parts of Europe to a lesser degree. But I want to know what this looks like, at the global scale, right? Because one of the criticisms I've seen you write about with respect to degrowth is that, and kind of the focus of sort of environmentalists more broadly on inequality and carbon footprints as a frame, right, is that it focuses on territorial distinctions. So saying it's the kind of the rich countries versus the poor countries, when, as you point out very correctly, so many people within rich countries are really struggling.
Yeah.
And yet, there is no denying that even among, middle to kind of lower income strata within a country like the US, there's still, a lot of climate and ecological impact associated with even a lifestyle that we would understand as like really struggling. Lifestyle is the wrong word, but I'll just leave it for now. And, I want to understand how your vision, this kind of very positive, kind of productivist vision of transforming the U.S. economy, how does that translate to, someone who is living on the front lines of, quite destructive extractive industries who might experience massive land use change as a result of the demands placed on their country for doing that? I think sometimes the kind of regional frame is also important to bear in mind, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, in some sense, I think because the U.S. is the largest historical emitter, and what that means is a lot of what we call climate injustice, floods in Pakistan or droughts in the Horn of Africa, like these impacts that are being felt in the global South are in large part caused by the historical responsibility of the U.S. that it's just this huge emitter for so many years. So That's why I think it makes it even more sort of urgent to decarbonize the U.S. economy absolutely as fast as possible. And in a just world, and I will mention that the only candidate calling for anything like this in the 2020 cycle was Bernie Sanders, where you actually need, you need an actual U.S. leadership where they would actually be doing technology transfer and kind of giving much of the global South this kind of means to decarbonize. And in many cases, it's something I bring up in the book, that much of the global South has no access to electricity. 800 million people around the world have no access to electricity. So kind of going back to Lenin's call, he defined communism as Soviet power, worker power, plus the electrification of the whole country, right? Because Russia at the time didn't have electricity. It was a very rural country. Obviously, like, again, since decarbonization is about changing these systems, we need to, because global South countries, they want reliable electricity. So we can't say, oh, well, we did it and you can't have it because now we have a crisis, right? So we need to decarbonize and then give them the means to decarbonize as quickly as possible. I do think that kind of global program could build that kind of solidarity between workers in the global North and South. And if you look at the history of anti-colonial movements in the global South, I did my dissertation on oil, and what often characterized a lot of these anti-colonial movements in the early to mid 20th century was actually not about things we tend to talk a lot about today, which is that when extraction happens, it harms communities and it poisons things, which definitely is true. But a lot of what the movements in the mid 20th century were really about taking sovereignty over their own national resources as states or as communities. I know Nigeria was fighting for what they called local resource control over the oil or over the resources that are being extracted. And that, to me, is a way in which left forces and kind of forces towards economic justice can start to link up with global South communities. And you're starting to see, like, the leftist governments in Chile and Mexico have floated the idea of nationalizing their lithium, which, again, would take more democratic control over that extraction and try to develop it, hopefully with unions involved and more strict regulations that could not make it so.
Elon Musk will do a coup because that's the thing he's actually promised to do in the past if anyone nationalizes their lithium.
Oh my God. It's so dark right now.
It's going to be great. Don't worry. It's fine. Sorry, I cut you off there.
But he can try to coup as much as he can. But, and in fact, like, that's the dark story of those 20th century movements. I mean, I was just about to bring up Mossadegh in Iran. They nationalized their oil on a really, like, popular anti-colonial, like, kick these Brits out of here. We want to control our own oil. And they did coup them, right? And it was horrible, right? Yeah. And they installed a violent, repressive regime in its place. So it's not easy, but again, I think we need to think about taking control. That's, to me, it's like, that's why I get kind of frustrated with growth or degrowth. It's not really, it's about control, it's about power. And we need more social democratic power over all the kinds of investments in the new green economy. And if global South nations and states and communities can take more collective power, I would hope we could trust them to develop them in more just ways. But I think that the left tends to now just sort of assume, like, any extraction at all is going to just be unjust and be destructive always. I think we have to realize that, again, in very impoverished areas, like what I think they would want is, I don't, this is a polarizing term, but not a productivist, but, like, building up infrastructure, building up their economy in ways that can lift people out of the horrific poverty we still see. I mean, again, not to go back to it, but electricity is over 100-year technology, and we still have not given all of humans this technology. It's just really a scandal of capitalism that we can't just give, and not just electricity, but basic plumbing, sewage, like just basic modern sanitation services. And somehow we think it's okay to exclude over 1 billion people from that kind of stuff. So a lot of, and I think degrowthers would agree that, like, in the global South, they do need to see growth in those sort of basic infrastructures, right? So, but that is a kind of it's more about production and building stuff and building a new world through kind of more democratic control.
It just sort of came to mind as we're talking about the international that, it very much was absent climate was absent, as you pointed out, from this election, but definitely thinking about like global responsibility when it comes to climate, very much absent very often from politics, except in the sense of, the way that the Biden administration tacked climate investment to kind of security concerns and a kind of like geopolitical standoff with China in particular. And I guess it's sort of an open-ended question, but I'm curious what you make of that, and if you think under a Trump presidency that will be sort of accelerated or kind of look any different.
Yeah, it's something I'm not sure on, and I've made some sort of predictions that who knows if it will turn out, but to me, it's a really difficult question. There was, I will say, I would call it like a kind of annoying neoliberal kind of approach to what neoliberalism was like, screw the workers, we're going to empower consumers, right? We're going to make it so you get cheap stuff, right? Cheap Walmart for everyone,
Greed is good, baby.
Yeah. And so empowering the consumer to give them cheaper stuff was sort of the orienting concern. And so I do feel like a lot of people want, they're upset with Biden for putting up tariff barriers because they say the quickest way to decarbonize would be if we could get cheaper solar panels from China, cheaper EVs from China, and just have a cheaper green utopia, right? And I think, rightfully so, I think the Biden administration recognizes that economic model where you just privilege global capital and cheap consumer goods harms people, and creates these kind of chasms of inequality that can lead to something like a Trump. And so they were trying to address it by putting up these tariffs, trying to privilege U.S. manufacturing. And I have perhaps these old nostalgic ideas about manufacturing, that there is something special about the geography of centralized manufacturing that brings a lot of workers together, that at least theoretically could bring a powerful labor organization in a central way through manufacturing. So as someone that wants to see the labor movement revived, I think if manufacturing is revived, it will help that process. So there's a lot of, but I also just really don't care for, from a political perspective, the kind of nationalism and obviously the geopolitical tension that is being created with China. So that I go back and forth, but I know that just like opening up free trade and cheap China EVs is not also the answer. So in terms of Trump, I think there are two kind of directions. I mean, in many ways, Trump is his whole message is about jobs and bringing back manufacturing. So a dark vision I have is that Trump, because a lot of these Biden investments are just getting off the ground, right? Mm-hmm. And they're gonna open the factory gates in 2025 and 2026. And what better way to kind of put the MAGA brand on factories and jobs and manufacturing than to just own those, as now these are Trump investments, right? Which is, again, a big frustration. Biden didn't work hard enough to own the investments.
They all get the Trump logo. They're all sort of black glass factory.
Yeah, like really dark. And so if these investments do what Biden intended, which is revive deindustrialized, impoverished communities and bring back jobs, and that's going to be Trump taking credit for it. And that could, again, a lot of us are worried now about this kind of realignment of American politics. We could sort of have a Trumpist realignment for decades. So that's the kind of dark vision. I think this is probably even darker. So the two dark visions is that the more sort of just full-on capitalist, these sort of vandals that want to just steal everything from everyone for themselves, get a hold of the Trump administration, which, let's be honest, he's mostly playing golf in Mar-a-Lago. Like, he's not that competent of a presider over government. So those sort of capitalist plunderers and vandals get control over the Trump administration, and I think they're just like, no, we're not doing these investments. We're cutting them. We're going to repeal the IRA. We're going to do tax cuts, right? And we're going to cut any support for these kind of federal investments in clean energy. And so I think it could be a mixture of those two, but in either case, I think it's dark.
Yeah. I have just one final question for you, and we've touched on a lot of these points already, but I think we can all rest assured the Democrats will certainly learn all the right lessons from this election. No, unfortunately, probably not. But if if you were to be, advising, sort of setting the campaign strategy of the Democrats going forward, setting, what their agenda is for 2028 now, what would be the big strategic orientation that you would advise? Particularly, I'm thinking around, organizing for what will by that point be like desperately overdue action on the climate crisis.
One other like glaring absence in this campaign cycle was any talk of healthcare. That was the big issue actually. Our barbaric country still, people go into bankruptcy because they don't have, because they get sick. It's horrific. And obviously the reproductive rights issue was related to the healthcare, but no one was talking about universal free healthcare anymore. So to me, that's kind of like maybe the starting point of why don't we give everyone free healthcare? And there's a meme where the shriveled guy's just, I want free healthcare. Like that would touch every American and would be just such a transformative thing, and it would be hard to pull off. But that to me is the starting point. I also think from a working class material needs, the other big issue that working class people are facing now is fundamentally housing. We have a utter housing crisis where even in a sort of deindustrialized Rust Belt city like my own Syracuse, we're seeing rents go through the roof, and people are having real trouble affording basic place to live. So again, you get these debates in the wonk world between the YIMBYs and whatever. But for me, as an old kind of socialist person, we need more public housing. We need to invest in kind of public subsidized housing for the masses, for poor people, and bring back housing security. And of course, a lot of people in the climate movement have been trying to make these connections, like Daniel Donna Cohen, between green housing, climate housing, and public housing, right? And there's just such a clear way we could sort of build public housing that is retrofitted with all the kind of new decarbonized trinkets that we need. And so the other thing is when the Green New Deal people were sort of visioning the idea of a Green New Deal, they thought it was really only going to make sense in not the same, but similar conditions as the original New Deal, which was, of course, the Great Depression. So you had a massive economic crisis and you had massive unemployment. And you had basically like the withdrawal of capital and investment from the whole society. And there was a real need for the government to kind of come in and put people to work and build this key infrastructure. Like, again, the TVA's slogan was electricity for all. Like
the Tennessee Valley Authority,
yes,
right? Yes,
the Tennessee Valley Authority. They were building dams and electric systems for rural people because the private companies felt like it wasn't profitable to service them. So electricity for all sounds like a Bernie Sanders slogan, right? Yeah. And so the Green New Deal visionaries really felt like, it's going to take another recession for this idea to really have legs. And so the problem became that recession was the COVID pandemic, right? And that wasn't your normal economic crisis or economic recession, as everyone should stay home, and we're doing something very different. And then of course once COVID ended, which of course we know we're still living with it, COVID, the economy opened back up, and then almost immediately we started to get what you would call like a very hot economy, where the labor market's actually quite tight and unemployment's quite low. So in that context, this idea of a public jobs guarantee or just public jobs in general does not make a ton of sense. So this is another, I'm sorry, dark vision, but I do think that vision will work better when, as we know it always will, capitalism goes into another crisis. Sure. We start to see unemployment much higher. Then you have, I think, an appetite for something like a public job guarantee, something like public works, jobs programs, and really putting people to do this kind of socially necessary work that needs to be done. And I think, like the New Deal era, a lot of what we need to do is really invest in kind of public shared infrastructure that capitalists that don't make a lot of money. Of course, I know Brett Christopher's recent book about our lives and their portfolio show they're trying to make money off infrastructure, but in the typical ways to build kind of shared social infrastructures like roads and bridges and electricity grids, it really takes public investment to really build those long-term investments. And so, so I think we'll see the economy's just been weirdly kind of hot
Yeah.
for a while. And I think the last opportunity we had to do this kind of transformative vision was 2008, and Obama really threw that opportunity away. So I think the next time there is a recession, I think we're going to see an opportunity again to bring back the idea. We might not call it a Green New Deal, but we'll call it something else, like a green jobs program, and we'll see.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It was fun.